everyone, I'm really excited to share with you my creative project, which is about indigenous solutions to the current land degradation crisis that Morocco is undergoing. And so specifically, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Amazigh art of the Agdal system. So getting right into it, I want to tell you a little bit about Morocco itself. Another thing I'd like to note before I really get into the presentation is that my citations are hyperlinked, so you can find the sources in either the PDF of this presentation that I've supplied in the Canvas posting, or if you just click through or find the links otherwise. So most Moroccans that you're going to meet won't really call it Morocco. They'll say Morocco or Maghreb, al-Maghreb, which means the West in Arabic. So Morocco, of course, then, is positioned in the very west of Africa, specifically the northwest. It borders the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean, but even though it's close to both of those really important sources of water, a lot of Morocco is dry. And that makes sense when you really think about it, because you think about the Sahara Desert. A lot of Morocco is very lush and very green. A lot of it is mountains, but a lot of it is also the desert. And that's getting worse, as I'll tell you about later, in terms of desertification and soil degradation. So Morocco is mostly arid, and we have these degraded lands that are degrading more and more every year. Most of the wealthy population, which is predominantly Arab, is going to live near northern coastal zones. That's Rabat, that's Casablanca. These are your really big cities. Rain isn't super uncommon there, but in a lot of other places, obviously, specifically the desert, or in the Sahara, it is rarer, and so agriculture is harder there. However, agriculture is crucial to Morocco. It's only 15% of its GDP, but it's 45% of its workforce. And why is there that big discrepancy? That comes down to the fact that many of Morocco's poorest indigenous communities, namely Berbers, live in the most arid regions, but they live in rural regions, which means they don't have access to urban or industrial jobs. So agriculture is the main thing that you can live off of. And obviously agriculture has the benefit of subsistence, so you can live off of your own food at the same time that you're making a business. However, doing agriculture is getting harder and harder, as I mentioned, because soil quality is decreasing. To get a really full picture of Morocco and the Agdal system that I'm going to lay out later in the presentation, I'd like to touch a little bit on the history of agriculture in Morocco. So we begin for thousands and thousands of years. The indigenous people of North Africa, the Berbers, they were the ones doing agriculture. Berbers are a predominantly agricultural people. They are pastoral herders. There is a stereotype that Berbers are nomads, and there is some truth to it, but that's not necessarily the case for all Berbers, but there is that very strong nomadic heritage, and that translates very, very well to mobile pastoralism. Otherwise, Berbers, for thousands and thousands of years on their own, were doing practices like the Agdal system, which is basically a community agricultural policy that you decide on as a tribe and is enforced by your tribe. And we mainly focused on growing wheat and barley and livestock like sheep and goats. Later on, I won't get into the exact dates because it goes back and forth, and so right now we're in the Alawite dynasty, is the current king of Morocco, but we go back and forth between Berber and Arab control and then eventually European control. But so in the Arab conquest, we see very, very prominent effects of the Arab agricultural revolution. And during the Arab agricultural revolution, we had Arabs who had a very similar history in working in a very arid, desert-heavy region, make really huge advances in agriculture, and those can be applied in other desert conditions to great success, but it often means an abandonment of traditional practices. And so the Arab agricultural revolution really emphasized sugar, citrus, rice, wheat, sorghum, And so it meant common techniques basically across the Islamic world. And during the Arab conquest and during the Arabization and Islamization of Morocco, we see sort of an emergence of private ownership of land as Berber identity and Berber tribes become more stigmatized or marginalized. Later, during the age of colonialism, we have Spanish and French influence, and this is when private ownership really takes off. So you see tribes getting smaller and smaller and smaller in their influence. And we see the mechanization, and there's a push to produce more and more crops that France and Spain want at any cost, which obviously can contribute to subpar or subsustainable land or agricultural practices. And so getting into the present, Morocco is now independent since 1956, which is great. However, our first and our continuing agricultural plans have not been outstanding, in my opinion. We had Operation Plow, which was trying to give farmers, and especially small farmers, access to fertilizers and brand new techniques. But in my opinion, that also contributed to some land degradation because of overuse of fertilizers, because Shla tend to think if this amount of something is good, then a lot of it must be really, really good. However, over-fertilizing doesn't really yield those effects. And so again, we see an emphasis on grain and wheat. And so more recently, as Morocco has been facing the 21st century, we have been focusing on the Green Morocco Plan and Law 113.13, which I will also get into later when we talk about Morocco's response to land degradation in particular. So the question is, why do I care about Morocco? Because I am Moroccan, and my family actually is very much tied to agriculture because we have a really small family farm. It was a subsistence farm for a long time, and now that my dad is in the United States, we send back remittances, and that's the main income, but obviously farming is still really essential. And our main crops are alfalfa and wheat, and we also raise livestock over there. On the left, you see some pictures of our home and our backyard in Amilago. And so what I've heard from my family is that we are very, very, very affected ourselves by these bigger processes going on in the world right now, such as desertification and soil degradation. And I think soil degradation and desertification, they are these sort of abstract terms, but they have a really strong tie not only to my heritage, but also to my identity, specifically my Amazigh identity. And my family, I'll get into this later again. I apologize, I keep saying that, but we have returned to the Agdal system somewhat in the outskirts of Amilago, and that's been very, very successful, at least until droughts have sort of jeopardized crops. So to get into that, I do want to touch on Amazigh or Berber culture. A lot of people, when they hear about Morocco, they know it's part of the Arab world, they know it's part of the Muslim world, so there is an assumption that it's just Arabs, but that's actually not the case. I also want to clear up a misconception, which is that Berber is a slur, and so a lot of Berber people prefer the term Amazigh, which means free, because they feel like Berber is etymologically linked to the word barbarian, but etymologically that is not true. That's not the origin of the word. And a lot of Berbers that you'll meet will refer to themselves as Berber. That's what my family's always done. And I'm going to use the term Amazigh and Berber interchangeably in this because the word Berber is associated with a lot of important terms like Berberization. So getting into a little bit more about what Berber culture looks like, you first have to explain the history. They are indigenous North Africans and they are distinct from Arabs. They have their own culture, they have their own religion. Sometimes most actually have converted to Islam at this point in time, and most of them did so many, many centuries ago. Nevertheless, these indigenous traditions persist. So, genetically speaking, since Berbers were the first people in North Africa, we also know that they are the majority of the population in terms of genetics. Most Moroccans that you'll meet have some kind of Berber ancestry. However, there are divisions when you're categorizing people by ethnicity in Morocco. So you have Arabs, you have Berbers, but you also have Arabized Berbers. And so only roughly 21% um, are identified as fully Berber, which is probably a problematic term. As I said before, there is a distinct linguistic, religious, and cultural heritage and culture within Berber communities, but that has also come with a strong degree of marginalization, especially as we continue to prioritize across the Middle East and North Africa Arab and Islamic identities. Um, and so to be a Berber is sort of to put yourself out there as someone who isn't as good of a Muslim or who is inferior to Arabs. And so there's been processes of Arabization and Islamization in Morocco for centuries and centuries. However, right now there is a pushback and a push to reclaim your identity as something to be proud of. And the state has responded to that by finally allowing parents to name their children Amazigh names, because in the past that was prohibited. Now, for example, Tamazight, which is the language or one language that Berbers speak, is now allowed, whereas before it was prohibited and it wasn't taught in schools. Um, and so there is that marginalization there. That marginalization also comes economically because Berbers are predominantly farmers. A lot of them live in rural and poor communities. They are pastoral herders still, and a lot of them are nomadic, although, like I said, the degree of nomadic heritage is somewhat exaggerated, although it is very much still a part of Berber history. And so, why am I telling you about Berber history when this is a class about international agriculture? And more importantly, what global conditions and global trends are affecting Moroccan agriculture? And so, how do all of these things intertwine? So, first, I want to touch on the fact that Morocco is in a very serious land degradation crisis. This is something that's happening all over the world. It's certainly happening in the US, but it's especially dire in Morocco. And that is because, as you can see in this map, I think it's mostly of the Atlas region. So, a lot of the mountainous region, which is obviously not ideal for agriculture, but that's nevertheless where a lot of agriculturalists have their homes and do their work. It is an arid or semi-arid, or it's on the arid and the very dry side, as opposed to a side that gets a lot of rain or is very fertile. So we're already starting out to some extent from a disadvantage from a land perspective. However, soil erosion has been making that problem even worse. We see here, especially again, as I said, in the mountainous regions of Morocco, you see the orange segment. Um, they're experiencing a very, very high degree of soil erosion. And in fact, a majority of the land in Morocco today is at least moderately degraded and depleted of essential nutrients, things like nitrates, and in fact, only about 4% is not degraded at all, or at least only 4% was as of 2000, according to the FAO. Of course, I assume that since then it has degraded much more. So I wouldn't be surprised if that 4% had dropped significantly. And so what does that really mean? Like, what is soil erosion and degradation? Like, what does that mean for farmers in an everyday sense? And so basically, when land degradation takes place, that land becomes less and less productive. So erosion, it depletes soil fertility, and CaCO3 accumulation reduces the availability of water to roots, while it can also cause waterlogging, which makes it really, really hard for your seeds that you planted to be successful. And so soil is also increasingly saline and fragile, but that's becoming even worse as a problem because farmers are planting more and more and more crops to keep up with demand, and also to try and make up the losses from the fact that the soil itself is already not as fertile as it once was. And so it's really a vicious cycle. And so basically, the end result of land degradation is that less is produced, even when you're planting more and more and more. And so bringing it back to the question of you, maybe the person that's watching this, why should you care about Moroccan agriculture? Well, it's an important part of the global food supply chain, specifically for the Middle East and North Africa, especially for Egypt, which, for example, make sure that all of its citizens can have bread, but then to have bread from a state source, you sort of need wheat. And Morocco is a really big supplier of wheat. Of course, Morocco also has ties to former colonial powers. It's kept those bonds, so in the European Union, but specifically with France and with Spain. There's also a very large problem with food insecurity in Morocco. Growing up, I know my dad, he lived on the farm, but sometimes things were so bad because of droughts or just other issues. He tells stories about having to eat the plaster off of the walls to have dinner, basically. And so food insecurity is a very, very large problem in Morocco. And from a utilitarian perspective, I'm sure nobody wants anybody to starve. So you should care about it in that sense. But where it really becomes scary is just in how precipitous the drop in production is in Morocco. So for example, in 2022, we have seen a 68.4% drop in Morocco's cereal production, which is intense and pretty scary. And a lot of that drop can be attributed to droughts that are going on, but it certainly isn't helped by the facts of land degradation. And so how do we explain land degradation? Why is it happening? There's 4 causes that I really want to highlight, but one of them I think is more important than the others, and that is overgrazing. So that's when you're letting your livestock eat the grass down, and not giving it time to regenerate between grazing. There's also overexploitation of land and resources, so I talked about it a little bit earlier, where farmers are just planting more and more and more because they're trying to make up for the fact that their crops simply aren't growing as well. There's also deforestation and removal of vegetation. That a little bit plays into overgrazing because you might graze a forest in the hope of having more land for your sheep to graze on. And there's also, as I referenced a little bit throughout, droughts and water unavailability, which is a problem that has existed basically as long as Morocco has as a desert. However, the Moroccan state identifies overgrazing as the #1 cause, the #1 anthropogenic cause, which means the human-made cause of degradation, and it ranks overuse as a close second. So the question then becomes, why is overgrazing happening right now? Why wasn't it happening generations ago? Why is this such a problem right now? Is it really due wholly to climate change? And the answer is no. The answer really lies in the fact that there has been a 63% decline in the nomadic population, which has contributed to an overall decline in mobile pastoralism. Mobile pastoralism, we know, is a very, very sustainable and a very positive way to raise livestock. And so that's sort of like transhumance. So you're moving your livestock around, you're not letting them feed in one place only, you're migrating, and they're getting to eat different grass from different fields. And that works very, very well in a sustainability sense. But that has been in decline because of the loss of nomadic tendencies in Morocco at large. We also see growing population pressures because Morocco is a rapidly growing country. This has led to a higher demand for meat and also to crops, but especially for meat, especially as Morocco itself is slowly climbing up the economic food chain. As I mentioned before, we see less transhumans and more sedentary farming, and also my main point is that we have seen a shrinking reliance on traditional local agricultural techniques. So what is the Moroccan state doing to solve this problem right now? Its responses have been pretty inflammatory among Berbers. So for example, in 2019, their main push for saving the land and the quality of the land, almost as part and parcel of the Green Morocco Plan, was Law 113.13. And so essentially this law promotes nomadic pastoralism, but it was criticized and rioted against pretty viciously for expropriating Amazigh land. So what this required was for Amazigh farmers who wanted to have their sheep graze in their ancestral land, they would have to get a permit. And so this feels like a loss of sovereignty for a lot of Amazigh farmers. So it was resisted pretty viciously. But the bottom line remains that action is still needed to reverse land degradation. And so if it's not coming from the state, where is it coming from? And my solution is the Agdal and a return to the Agdal system. What is an Agdal then? An Agdal refers to a Berber tradition of local communal resource management and regulation. And so how do Agdal systems work? What do they consist of? They regulate how much you can graze your animals in an area and how much you can harvest. They regulate which methods you can use, so you can't do certain forms of tree cutting, but you can do others. It limits which crops you can harvest and which ones you have to leave alone. And most importantly, it regulates when you may harvest or graze your animals in an area. And so traditionally we see this periodicity in the form of open seasons or closed seasons, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail later on. But so essentially Agdals work by eliminating the tragedy of the commons because these are tribal arrangements. So they're being originated by and formulated by local tribal officials called kebs. And so everyone is agreeing to these agreed upon communal rules, and you know that it's going to help you in the end. And it's people that you trust. It's people that look just like you, are from your family, and people that you trust really, truly, and deeply. And you know that they have your best interests at heart, which is a challenge, I think, for the Moroccan state in pushing agricultural or really many other forms of legislation. Is there is a sense of corruption, and there is a sense that, well, I don't know these people, because Morocco, in my opinion, is still tribalistic in some senses. And so what are the key features of the Agdal system? I mentioned the opening and closing schedules. I gave an example that for your closing system, your closing session might be that no one can access it from May to July. That's not normally the exact month-to-month arrangement. I believe spring is a main session, but I would have to, it varies from tribe to tribe. But so other key features include Ait Rabben. So Ait means people of, and so that refers to guardians who enforce the rules. So if you are not in an open season, you're not going to be able to get in. And if you do get in, then there will be consequences. There is also a prohibition on outsiders. So if you're not in the tribe, then you can't really access the parcel of land that the Agdal system is taking care of. And so basically the Agdal system is when local pastures and forests are set to be off limits for harvesting and grazing during the closed schedules. This is really essential because it gives vegetation and soil the time to reproduce and rejuvenate that it needs. So contrast this, if you will, with the scenario in which farmers are growing and growing and growing, and they're growing constantly, and they're planting even when it's not the ideal season because they need to make up their crops. And they need to make up those crops, especially because they're worried about competition from other people in their tribe. And so they're trying to use as much of these resources as they can. And so that's why the Agdal system sort of helps us circumvent the tragedy of the commons. Additionally, the closing schedule allows for things that might get overlooked if you're just in a rush to produce sheer increases in production. So a lot of farmers might not be able to spread manure if they're just constantly planting, but a lot of farmers under Agdal systems use closed periods to spread manure, which is obviously a great natural fertilizer over these areas, which again helps replenish the soil, leading to better yields in the end. Where do Agdals come from then? They come from local agricultural expertise. So we know that locals oftentimes have a lot of knowledge that outsiders might not have, and that becomes a really big problem in Morocco because Morocco has been so subject to outside influence, France and Spain and Arab traditions. And so there's been sort of a loss in the idea that other people know better than me. I couldn't possibly have something better to contribute because I'm just Berber. That is a real sentiment. Um, and so there was sort of that loss of confidence. Another way that the Agdal originated was that it refers and it banks really heavily on Berber religious rituals, which are a unique non-Islamic tradition. And so open schedules for a lot of Agdal systems, they begin on holy days for Berbers, and there is a whole Berber calendar, agricultural calendar, that a lot of open and closed sessions fall directly onto. There's also the idea of saints, and so I believe in Yaqub there is Sidi Boujma, who is a saint who, if it is believed, if you do rituals correctly and if you put forth enough tributes and good enough tributes, then your land will be fecund and it will be fertile and you'll have a great yield. There's also the idea of a care for ancestral lands among Amazigh people because a lot of Amazigh identity is tied to your land. So why did Agdals disappear in the first place if they were so great? The answer is re-Islamization and Arabization of Morocco really made Berber traditions unacceptable and taboo, especially because of that religious element. You don't want to be associated with non-Islamic practices because you're really scared of committing shirk, which is in Islam a really grave sin. So there was also an increased demand for crops, which required more and more concentrated and more constant use of your agricultural resources, even though that constant use was not to the benefit in the long run. Looking into what benefits Agdals actually give back to us, we see that it gives vegetation time to reproduce and regenerate during closed cycles. The spreading of manure allows the replenishment of things like nitrates in the soil. We also see that it has economic boosts for these really poor rural communities. So it's not just that you're able to produce more than you would even if you were farming 12 months out of the year, but you're also able to trade access to your Agdal pasture to another tribe, or you can trade access to your pasture for access to their water well. Water issues are a huge contention among Moroccan tribes, at least in Eritrea, where my family is from. And so it has really big social benefits, but also economic benefits. And any way that you can take in more money as a poor rural farming family is really important. It can also increase biodiversity between the different tribes, Agdals, and it also increases accountability because when there is a sense that this is my pasture, this is the pasture of my people and my tribe, and so I need to take care of it, and I can't violate these sacred rules that I've come to with my fellow tribesmen. And so do Agdals actually work in practice? And there's only a little bit of research on it because Berbers in general are pretty obscure people on the world stage, but The preliminary research suggests that egg dolls are actually a really great tool for conservation as we look forward into Morocco's 21st century. For example, Badjout et al. Showed that non-egg doll systems had a loss in forest coverage, whereas egg doll systems actually increase their forest coverage. And so, egg doll systems, almost in the same way that intermittent fasting decreases the amount that you eat, they also decrease egg doll systems decrease the amount of overgrazing that can take place, and they decrease the amount of soil overuse. And this means that you aren't running the soil and wringing it out because you're using it less, but you're also giving it time to reproduce and recover and work for you in perpetuity. So ultimately, I believe that egg dolls can lead to really superior yields. So for my creative project, I wanted to show and also consider what an egg doll might look like at two different times. So the first time I wanted to look at what an egg doll would be in the closed session immediately after a pasture has been depleted. So this is right after open season has closed. And then I also wanted to look at open season itself, when the land and the world and the pasture is rejuvenated and it's open for people who want to come and graze or people who want to harvest crops. So I'll show a little bit more of the details. I think my camera is covering the access to, oop, okay, well I guess it went away. But in the egg doll system, for the closed season, I tried to show the Atlas Mountains, which are a key part of Moroccan visuality, in my opinion. I also have a gate which is closed to indicate an access. Um, there's empty soil and mainly furnished with paper, vegetation, and that vegetation is also very sparse because it has been used up during the open season, which has just ended. We also see, though, gold marks on the soil, and those sort of represent rejuvenation because during this closed season, the land has time to recover, and so it can bring forth something really positive and something really great. In my open season, I have attached to the side of the board a flap, and so you can put the felt cover on and you can take the felt cover off, and that sort of represents the cyclical nature of the egg doll system. And so for the open season, I obviously have an open gate on the right to indicate that tribes can't access this right now. I also have the richly colored felt that I mentioned to represent the nutrient replenished soil, the grasses, the vegetation, which are all growing back, not necessarily this lush in reality in Morocco, because Morocco just is a very dry place, but in comparison to what we had before. And this has really given the land and the soil time to recover, and that means that we're capable of having animals graze without permanently damaging the environment. So I also included some sheep and some goats. And I also included some wheat crops because wheat is a huge deal in Moroccan agriculture. And that wheat is stuff that's worthy of harvest in terms of quantity, but also quality. And I felt like that really symbolized productivity, which I feel can increase under ag doll systems. And then finally, I also included a farmer, which I modeled after my cousin Majda, who always wears maroon. And I hope that you guys also believe in the future of the egg doll system in Morocco. Sometimes a return to indigenous ideas can be very beneficial because I do feel that locals know their agricultural circumstances best. And I know that until the recent droughts, in Amilago, there had been a little bit of a reversion back to the egg doll system where people were communicating and deciding when they would have their open season and when they would have their closed season for their pastures, and it had really positive effects on alfalfa yields. Of course, in recent years, there haven't been as great advances in productivity, but I think a lot of that is attributable to the fact that Morocco is in a very harsh drought season at this time. So again, if you would like to check out any of the sources that I linked in this presentation, they are available if you just click on the hyperlinks in my PDF of this presentation. And if you want to see a closer look of the poster is available also on a PDF. And thank you so much. I really enjoyed learning more about my traditions, and I look forward to seeing everyone else's presentations.